All right, I'm a few minutes late. I apologize, but we're here. We are looking at a paper tonight called Africa. It's called Africa Challenge of the Unfinished Revolution. It's a paper by LADUN Anise, and this is a pretty old paper. Goes back to 1974. But when I went through aspects of the paper, I actually like some of the language in this paper. So hopefully you guys will like the language that you see as well. We're going to start the show. Before I start the show, I just want to point out that the Harsh Reality Podcast dropped a new episode this morning. You guys should check it out. Pretty dope conversation. You guys check that out. And also check out the Pro Black Perspectives last show on Sunday. That was a short show, but a good show all the same. So make sure you guys check it out. So on the other side of the introduction here, we are going to begin reading this show.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio. Welcome to the Bitter Medicine Podcast, where it's all about Black empowerment. Our show focuses on Black news and entertainment, arts, science, economics, history, people, and strategies that uplift, empower, and motivate Africans within the diaspora. And now your host, whose favorite color is black, Goku.
Welcome back to the Bitter Medicine Podcast. I am your host, Koku. Just want to remind you guys before we get the show rolling that this show is part of a podcast network called KWAZ Radio. There are other shows on the network you are invited to tune into.
This is W.E.B with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the Pro-Black Perspective, where Black problems are addressed with Black solutions.
Greetings, fam. Tune in to The Learning Curve with me, the Revolutionary Matron on KWAZ Radio.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Welcome back to the Bitter Medicine Podcast. I am your host, Koku. Going to read another paper today. Remember to subscribe to the KWAZ Radio YouTube channel because I'll be doing the next show, as always, from this year going forward. The Thursday show will be exclusively on KWAZ Radio. We're working on actually doing a Learn Swahili, Kiswahili, I guess conversational Kiswahili. We're working on that, very close to getting it done. That will also be exclusively on KWAZ Radio. And I want to do it in such a way where the tutor, I want it to be a thing where, there'll be some of us on the panel being tutored and you guys can learn along with us. But I want to just drop this little seedling in your ear. I want to be able to compensate the teacher. So, I will ask for tips. Not even donations per se, but tips. Let's get tips going for the instructor when that show starts. That's going to be on KWAZ Radio. All right. Let's get to the paper. In fact, what I'm going to do, the first time I'm doing that in this 2022 format, I'll drop the StreamYard link. Now, this is going to be a paper that I'm reading, But if you hear something and you want to speak to it, you can jump on the link. Using the link, you can jump on the panel and you can share your thoughts verbally live on air about aspects of the paper that we're reading. Speaking of that, let me share the paper right there. All right, so here's the paper. You guys can see the screen. You guys can hear my voice. Again, if I read something that's of interest to you, that resonates with you, and you want to hop on live on the air and speak to it, click the link right there. That's the StreamYard link. You don't need any extra software or anything, hardware. Just your phone is fine, or your computer with microphone, and you could hop on and join us in the conversation. All right. With that said, let's get to the reading. Africa, challenge of the unfinished revolution. The world has entered a new age. The youth of the third world are increasingly abandoning the traditional call for gradual social reform, for the new dawn of revolutionary transformation of old values, old structures, and established institutions. For this new breed of human beings, every social change requires a revolution to bring it into being. This clarion call for revolution everywhere to solve every problem is not altogether misplaced or surprising. The world we have inherited thrives on hypocrisy, unfulfilled expectations, and broken promises. What the peoples of the third world have experienced under the aegis of Western civilization is a kiss of death, which pollutes life, stifling and choking it out of its power for self-regeneration. In order to establish a new civilization, to create a new social order, to evolve a new culture, and to disabuse human institutions of their entrenched injustices, this new breed of youth has been nurturing itself on the ideology of revolutionary change. The vanguard of the revolutionary theoreticians increasingly insist on the inevitability of armed struggle as the means of realizing the objectives of thorough and profound social transformation. Africa is no stranger to this new revolutionary spirit, whose waves send chilling ripples across the balkanized centers of power on the continent. What becomes apparent in the emerging African revolutionary consciousness are the dangers of a misconceived and hence misdirected revolutionary energy. The beginning of the modern African revolution has a direct and effective challenge to the presumptions of alien rule. In this challenge, the first generation of African nationalists made their mark on contemporary history by seeking to transform the status of dependence into the conquest of national sovereignty. But the African struggle for independence, loosely defined as the first contemporary African revolution, was, for the most part, crippled by its own internal contradictions. These contradictions, magnified in the post-independence era, have begun to generate doubts in the minds of the second and third generations of would-be nation builders. The basic objectives of the African Revolution were A, total decolonization of Africa, and B, total transformation of African societies by reactivating African humanism and recreating a man-centered culture through planned nation and state building. The first necessary step in the realization of these revolutionary objectives was the removal of the physical presence of the European colonizers. But this necessary removal is the least important of the many aspects of the comprehensive transformation called for in the ideology of independence. For the most part, the revolution seemed to have stagnated at the point when most of the African nationalists achieved political independence. In most of independent Africa, we now have what amounts to a betrayed revolution. That is, a revolution which has abandoned its original intent, a revolution which has been beguiled into an immobilized rapport with the instrumentalities and concealed arms of foreign exploitation. That's a good opening to that paper. I hope you guys appreciated that there. That's a good opening. If you're here listening to me, hit 1 so I can know I'm not reading to myself. Not that it's not going to matter too much, but I appreciate knowing if you're here. Hit 1 if you're here. What are these internal contradictions which have betrayed the African Revolution? First, the initial struggle for independence in African states did not arise from, nor did it lead to any profound transformation of the mental and psychological makeup of either the African peasantry or the African nationalists. You know, I have this paper talking about the African peasantry's revolution. It's kind of a long paper, but I'm really thinking about reading that live on air too. You guys let me know if that sounds interesting to you. With the exception of Algeria and the Republic of Guinea, political independence was achieved through peaceful negotiations with the metropolitan powers of Europe. The constitutional conferences were held principally in London, Paris, and Brussels, and the nationalists called for political independence only after they had been denied access to what they considered their rightful places in the colonial establishment. You know, I hadn't thought about that. That's an interesting line right there. A lot of those early African leaders were initially hoping to be, you know, the black faces in the colonial establishment. If you start from there, I see Mr. Untouchable is here in the learning curve. That's the revolutionary matron is here. If you start from there, then I understand why we got the quote unquote independence movements that we got in Africa. Yeah, that's interesting. And again, this is why I say reading these papers are kind of nice. You get right into the information for the most part. Now, depending on the author and who, you know, where the author is trying to publish, they might be on some bullshit come conclusion time, as you saw in last Tuesday's paper. But you know, oftentimes we get right to the heart of the matter, and that's a thought that I hadn't thought about before. Well, it makes a lot of sense after you've read it. Thus, the independence so achieved was another form of indirect rule, or put differently, government by remote control. Political independence meant the Africanization of the personnel of government, party, and bureaucracy, but not the transformation of basic value orientation, basic social and political institutions, or a basic transformation of the philosophy of government, education, and socialization. So I have a question for you guys who might be listening live or listen to the playback. Was this mere oversight on the part of those first Africans who were pushing for independence? Or was it mere oversight on their part? Or was it laziness on their part? Or was it straight up sabotage on their part? Right? So you guys let me know. Secondly, most, if not all, the African nationalists promised more than they could deliver through any radical mobilization of national resources. The result has been the revolution of rising expectations, coupled with rising frustrations caused by unfulfilled promises. This means that consumptive and demand tastes far outdistance productive and supply capabilities everywhere. Thirdly, because African nationalism was essentially an ideology of anti-colonialism, it was founded on a single issue consensus that could not be transferred functionally into the post-independence period. The consensus on political independence by substituting black faces for white ones could not be sustained under the reemergence and the coincidence of regional, ethnic, religious, and cultural cleavages, which are easily exploited by the invisible hands of neocolonialism and the greed for power by corrupt African politicians. Fourthly, African independence was an elitist achievement. The competition for its reward, status, and deference has been confined largely within the elite stratum, with occasional crumbs flowing to the peasants that constitute 80% of the African population. Peasants constitute 80% of the African population. That's that old 80-20 rule playing out again. Given the nature of this elite class, its disposition toward a material acquisitive culture characterized by a high rate of conspicuous consumption of luxury goods and a low rate of productivity, there could be little doubt about the betrayal of the fundamental meaning of the African Revolution. Rather than transform society, the elite class has reinforced the stranglehold of alien values, and by so doing, has intensified the continued oppression of the African masses. Right? We talked about this a lot in the past on this show about the African elites basically sold out Africans, and we see it here again in this paper, right? And the continued alien domination and exploitation of the African economy. Again, that's to continue that thought. Sorry, it continued on another page. In the chat, I see we have the learning curve is here. Mr. Untouchable is here. The learning curve says, we are dealing with the same thing today. Black is global, so is colonization. Mr. Untouchable says colonialism and blackface. He says a little of everything, LOL. So he's referring to those three things I put up. Was it laziness? Was it just an overlook? Or was it sabotage? So he thinks it's a little of all those things. I'm kind of beginning to believe it's more sabotage. You know, at one time I used to believe, oh, they just didn't think of it. But then I got old and I realized, wait, these guys were smart guys. You look at a lot of those first leaders, those guys were engineers and all kind of stuff. They weren't dummies. You know? The learning curve says we cannot change anything until we decide to change the economy. We have always been told to think through our Eurasian problems with Eurasian consciousness. That's our downfall right there for sure. The learning curve says, I would like to hear about African peasants. Okay, so she's talking about that paper that I mentioned. I'll have to pull that up. The learning curve also says benign neglect is global. I agree with that too. Benevolent dictatorship. I think that's our best bet going forward. To continue, true to its class interests, the elite class has been nurturing a distorted ideology of development. By development, the elite generally means rapid economic development through rapid industrialization and a half-hearted emphasis on the mechanization of agriculture. So that's a common theme you'll see when you critique Africa. One of the problems with Africa was that Africans, the elite, the leadership class, which would be the elite as well, wanted to modernize Africa by waving in this industrialization that Africa wasn't really ready for. You see, again, like Learning Curve said in the chat, you know, we've been trying to solve this African problem with the Eurasian solution, but the issue was that Europe was ready for industrialization when they became industrialized. The continent was not ready for it then. And to be able to industrialize the continent in that time, this is where you have all those IMF loans and foreign aid, quote unquote aid, and all this kind of stuff, because there's no way. And I think Oni broke this down in a show he did maybe 2 years ago or something, where you're talking about industrializing, and you're talking about bringing in, tractors, and tractors like a six-figure or near six-figure, expenditure that, and that's just for one, right? So imagine trying to scale that up to serve the needs of the continent. That's where we went wrong. We should have focused on agriculture and being able to secure food security, making sure there wasn't scarcity going on. So those are the critiques you'll hear often, and this paper is kind of talking about that now too. This ideology of development is erroneous, not because rapid economic development is undesirable, but because it ignores social, cultural, and spiritual developments while it focuses on materialism. That's it right there. From historical experience, we know the profound consequence that unrestrained materialism has unleashed in Western societies. Thus, to ignore the moral, cultural, and spiritual content of development is to develop an amoral society. Such an ideology would ultimately cripple the growth of African humanism. That is, cripple that very essence that gives Africa her comparative moral advantage and superiority over the decadence of Western materialism. Drop a one if you agree with that. Two if you disagree with that last paragraph. These are not the only dangers. The foreign exploiters of the African economy continue to emphasize the need for African states to expand their export crop production, petroleum production, and to engage only in selective industrialization, preferably concentrating on light industries. These economic experts do not encourage African governments and states to develop self-sufficiency in food crop production, nor do they suggest any means of transforming the African economy from essentially raw material production into the processing and export of finished products. Thumbs up there. There is also a grave danger in the unrestricted exploitation of African petroleum and other mineral reserves. For one thing, these extractive materials are not unlimited. For another, the industrialized countries have adopted the strategic policy of domestic resource conservation. That is, they seem to have decided to exploit foreign extractive resources to depletion, while carefully conserving their domestic reserves for the periods of projected future shortages. Thus, when the world has been milled dry, they would still have domestic sources of energy to draw upon. This irrational exploitation of African resources for present exchange and revenue reasons may have the unanticipated effect of robbing Africa of future energy and revenue sources. This would perpetuate Africa's state of dependence on the industrialized Western society. That is a hell of a point. That is a hell of a point this writer just made here. That is a hell of a point this writer just made. And you're going to see where this writer, this author, he continues this assault on this white boy in this paper. Furthermore, the ideology of development assumes that rapid industrialization is a cure for all of African economic problems. This ignores the fact that modern industries, to be efficient and competitive in both foreign and domestic markets, must increasingly become capital and not labor intensive. Thus, the development of capital intensive industries, which increasingly must rely on the advanced technology of automation and cybernetics, may not necessarily reduce the rising rate of unemployment appreciably. The conclusion is hardly escapable that the ideology of development needs a radical reformulation if Africa is to cope with an international economic system in which raw materials receive less and less returns while manufactured products become more and more expensive. The present reality is that Africa is largely the exporter of raw materials and the importer of manufactured products. Man. Again, we know this, but we should know this, but there's something to be said about how poignant you make a point. And I think the point is being made really well here. There are other areas in which the African Revolution has either been betrayed or misdirected. 4 of these are most important. First, African liberation makes nation building and state building imperative. Nation building in this sense means the consolidation of the ethnic or nationality groups in the political state into a coherent body of citizens, such that a pluralistic community is built. That's a good definition. In such a society, ethnic, regional, cultural, linguistic, and religious differences are carefully divested of their social and political conflict, potentials, and saliencies, and are transformed into an organic unity of cultural diversity and pluralism. State building, on the other hand, addresses itself to the rationale development of the apparatus of government so that efficient allocation and optimum utilization of national resources could be achieved. This, in turn, involves a rational transformation of social and political institutions to achieve responsible, representative government and a culture of shared political and economic power. The observable failure to develop a political culture of shared power and social accountability in most independent African states has resulted not only in the succession of military takeovers since 1963, but also in serious political instability, political violence, secession, chaos due to greed, corruption, administrative ineptitude, power struggles, and an absence of a legitimized constitutional framework for leadership succession and the peaceful transfer of authority. I like that. By 1965, for example, many of the civilian politicians and governments in independent Africa had lost the will, the capacity, and the integrity to govern. This gradual emergence of irresponsible leadership created power vacuums across the continent, which resulted in national disintegration and increasing Pan-African disunity. Pan-African disunity. During the first decade of African independence, there were at least 30 successful coups d'etats in 17 of the 42 independent states. Every state reported at least 2 attempted coups, while more than 400 cases of assassinations, mutinies, riots, and uprisings were reported in all. This record was not superseded by the Latin American countries that are traditionally known to be prone to military takeovers. It is disturbing to note that not more than 3 of these military takeovers could be said to represent a forward march for the African Revolution. That's a well-stated point. All these coups that we've witnessed or read about, learned about, what did they really do to push Africa forward? Nothing. The most noticeable effects of these takeovers have been the erosion of governmental authority, the politicization of the armed forces, and their exposure to the corrosive power of corruption. We can also add to this list the doubling of military expenditures in each of the countries following armed seizure and state power. Second, African political independence has reinforced economic dependence and exploitation by foreign corporate capitalism. The economic domination was worked into the agreements under which independence was negotiated. I imagine he's going to go into, or at least allude to, like the Francophone countries. Like you gotta be pretty weak when you were gaining quote unquote independence from France to say, you know what, we're still going to put 100% of our monies into the French Reserve. I think they've since backtracked that now, and it's down to like 50%. But you got to be a real whole-ass African leader, right, to make that a rule of your independence movement. This economic domination was worked into the agreements under which independence was negotiated. In essence, it means that Africa is being governed largely for the economic well-being of non-African peoples. This system of government by remote control, which is what we mean by neocolonialism, constitute a great danger to the survival of the African peoples. and should constitute a great target for the concentration of revolutionary activity on the continent. Third, there is a great need for a profound cultural transformation and a concentrated attack on the aping of a decaying Western civilization, a civilization which is showing deep signs of moral confusion and an increasing capacity to stem the tide of social injustice and dehumanization. African humanism and the African sense of organic familyhood and community will not withstand the forces of the emerging materialism and class system in Africa unless the children of the new dispensation mobilize their energies into creating the new cultural environment that would foster the healthy growth of these pivots of the African essence. I mean, you can't disagree with that. That to me, a large part of that third one is the education again. Fourth, and perhaps most important, there is a profound need for a mental or psychological and revolutionary transformation of the African individual. The betrayal of the African Revolution is most evident in the Africans' misconception of decolonization. African nationalism took decolonization to mean simply the removal of the physical presence of the colonizer. As the colonizers moved out of the governor's mansions and the colonial segregated residential areas, the African replacements moved in. In the process, we construed Africanization to mean putting Africans in the positions formerly held by the colonizer, like Mr. Untouchable in the chat said, colonialism and blackface. We forget to ask ourselves whether the form of government the colonizers imposed on us was valid for our needs and objectives. We forgot to so this author is doing what I've done, which is it, again, this goes back to those three, that multiple choice thing I put down. Is it the case that in the frenzy for independence, folks just forgot? Or is it in the frenzy, folks just thought that what was happening was working, but needed more Africans to have a self-invested interest so that certain acts of tyranny or oppression that was going on with an African in charge of these institutions now that were built by the colonizer, that things will change just organically. But to me, all of that is a mistake. You had to go in there with a complete, and I think this paper is touching on some of the areas that you had to go in there completely revolutionary. And to go, and the thing is, you had this example from Haiti. Haiti should have been Haiti for its pros and its cons around 1804, 1791 to 1804. You should have learned from that. Haiti's biggest problem was, well, number one, they paid France money. I don't understand why Africans are paying France money all the time. And two, they carried on the same system that the French had. And then you wonder why shit don't work your way. You wonder why shit doesn't work your way. We forgot to ask ourselves whether the form of government the colonizers imposed on us was valid for our needs and objectives. We forgot to question the philosophy of education the colonizers left behind. We had no time to modify, let alone transform, the system of social and bureaucratic differentiation they left behind. We wear, quote unquote, tails and tuxedos while singing the poetic praises of negritude. As parliamentarians, we kept on collecting, quote unquote, bush allowances for any night we spend in our own homes and constituencies in the, quote unquote, rural areas because the colonizer used to collect bush allowances for every trip he made away from the colonial capitals. It's cringeworthy at this point. As members of the privileged elite, we demand car allowances, house allowances, pets allowances, travel allowances, until we have virtually eaten up all the available national wealth. As the new Europeans and black skins, we heap contempt on anything made locally. We cultivate our taste for the expensive goods that come from what we, in our worst moment of degradation, used to call, quote, the mother country. We were brainwashed, but we did not know it. Our mental apparatus, our psyche, our inner selves are still colonized, and our minds are still everywhere in chains. Yeah, this author is doing some work here. This is where the revolution must be reactivated until we rediscover our inner essence and reclaim our lost souls. Our imported ideologies and warped values betray the superficiality of our commitment or our conviction. We know how to seize state power in the name of the people, but we have not yet learned how to govern on behalf of the people. No, that guy's spitting. No, the guy's spitting. This guy is making some valid points here. We know how to go and overthrow power. We know how to go and negotiate with co-conspirators and get militias and, if not full-out armies behind us to go and overthrow some shit, right? We know how to seize state power in the name of the people, right? Which is what we claim when these coups and all that shit occur. But we have not yet learned how to govern on behalf of the people. This is where the revolution was lost and betrayed, for political decolonization left our colonized minds and institutions unchanged. And that is why our values are warped and our culture bastardized. And that is why Africa remains chained to the forces of neocolonialism, or government by remote control. I like that. Let me check in with the chat, and I'll take a commercial break in a second. Bobby Wright is here saying, greetings, Koku and panel. I appreciate you for coming through, Bobby Wright. I appreciate all you guys for tuning in. Those of you especially here live with me. I don't know if YouTube is playing around. I see there's only one person here, but I think that's YouTube doing this foolishness. By the way, the Partiality Podcast talked about it on their show that on the episode that they dropped this morning. Again, check it out. I won't spoil too much, but they talked about how, like, on YouTube, the video views that they have on YouTube have been dropped. And I have talked about that in the past, where I know a video had X amount of views and I'll come back and meet it down almost half sometimes. Right? That's a little game YouTube is playing too, by the way. But in the chat, there was some activities. Mr. Untouchable said they were intelligent but not black-centered. They were well-trained in their professions with no knowledge of self, bro. Tragic results. The learning curve says we need internal and external economic policies that they should be different. Mr. Untouchable says the ultimate goal was external dependency. We will extract your natural resources, convert it, then sell the byproducts back to you. That's a cold game, but that's the game that they played. The learning curve says Africa built the pyramids. All of a sudden, we can't build anything. Integration and slavery stole from us. Today, they're building cars with literal trash. They only keep power by keeping us divided. That's absolute truth. You guys tune into the most recent Shoot the Breeze. We Mr. Untouchable posted a prompt that looked at a young African kid who was 18. Took him 3 years to build it. So he was 15 when he started. He built a car from scraps. And who was there to document it? Some white boy. Some white boy. I bet you money you're going to see some small, simple cars come out soon enough that will be in the marketplace. Trust me. Mr. Untouchable says to the matron in Africa, I think tribalism is an internal problem, sis, not an external one. The matron says to Mr. Untouchable, they are the middlemen, and they continue to make wealth for themselves by selling us the refined version of our resources. She goes on to say, I think they're all gatekeepers against the diaspora, but we are dealing with the elites. Mr. Untouchable says, I understand the elite argument, no doubt, but I also think that the people at the bottom are also complicit. The matron says they are because they want to be elite. They are largely weaponized against us, and because they are neo-colonized, they don't know the things they don't know. Absolutely. I agree with that 100%. She says we need a talented 10th that listens, and we need a benevolent dictator. Absolutely. Mr. Untouchable says, I think that in the frenzy for independence, your people should have been prepared for it. If we get rid of 100 British doctors, we need to have 100 African doctors waiting to replace them. That's how I think too, Mr. Untouchable. But I was trying to be fair in my thoughts and say, well, maybe, is it possible? But how could all those people forget? You know? But it was obvious. If you're getting rid of that system, you have to have your own, you have to have done your work. Which is why in later years, I came to the conclusion that it's sabotage. I see we got some trolls in the room here. The Learning Curve says, why do we need money on our land? Who are we paying to live on our land? Mr. Untouchable says, if we get rid of 100 commercial white South African farmers, we needed to have 100 black South African commercial farmers to replace them. Throwing them out was half the battle. Absolutely. Block that person. Absolutely. So what I want to do, I want to take a station ID break here. We're about, I think we're a little bit more than halfway through the paper. Let me do a station ID break here just to remind you guys that this show is part of a podcast network.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is W.E.B with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
Greetings, fam. Tune in to The Learning Curve with me, the revolutionary matron on KWAZ Radio.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Have you ever considered joining KWAZ Radio? Each of our hosts shares their unique perspective with you. You might have a perspective that needs to be shared. If that's true, hit us up at kwaz.radio@gmail.com. What are you gonna do? What you gonna do?
What are you going to do? The matron said something here that I think is important. It's a point I've been trying to get across really for the longest time. She says, experience is the best teacher. We are not going to learn until we try. We must do the work of trying. And the point that I've been trying to get across for a while now, in fact, I think I said it recently on one of these recent episodes, is we have this thing going on in our society where we poo-poo and shoot down everything. By the way, guys, make sure to hit the like button. If you're listening to my voice, if you're hearing this episode, make sure to hit the like button. But we have this bad habit of everything. No one can come up with a thought. No one can come up with a thought. Every thought is just shot down. And I know that there's some thoughts that are just friggin' ridiculous. I get it. But the idea is that we can't just poo-poo a thing without trying to do it. We've had brilliant people since the beginning of this struggle. We've had brilliant people drop in game, drop in knowledge. And frankly, with a lot of these brilliant people, we've never really done or tried out the theories that they had or the instructions that they gave, if we're being honest. Some months back, I read this John Henry Clark paper where he basically gives the instructions for like an African-centered curriculum, but a lot of people haven't done it. It's better to try something, fail, and be able to go back and try it again, tweak what you have to tweak until you get it correct. One thing I like about Silicon Valley, they have a mentality that now that mentality might not work for you, black man, black woman, but it's a strong mindset. It's like, if you're gonna fail fast. Don't waste 7, 8, 9, 10 years of your life working on something that isn't showing positive results. So when it comes to this liberation type stuff, this nation building, this power stuff that we're talking about, try the things that the great teachers and elders and stuff put down. And if it's failing, well, let it fail and fail fast. But at least you tried. You learn from it. You have some data. Now I sound like Tone Talks and Yvette Carnell. But you have something to go back to and look at and see what was making some sense and what was making no sense. The learning curve says, to follow up that point, experience is the best teacher. We are not going to learn until we try. We must do the work of trying. She says, facts. I deal with this all the time. People tell you thousands of reasons why it won't work. It just needs to work one time. One time. But we have a lot of black naysayers, and I've talked about that in some of my first shows was about that stuff. Low energy individuals. Low energy individuals, some of the biggest naysayers out there. We don't want to sit down going back and forth over the same shit all the time. And nothing physically, nothing tangible is being done in the meantime. Get off of that stupid shit. I'm not the biggest fan of certain ideologies, but if you think it's going to work, put in the work and let's see something. Let's see what comes of it. Mr. Untouchable says, I agree. The philosophies and opinions of Garvey is still sitting on our bookshelves, waiting to be executed by our people. Fundamental stuff. Carlos A. Cooks. It is an unknown person for the most part. Garvey has this book called Message to the People. How many people have Message to the People? By the way, it's on the Discord, under the BM library. But all we doing is shitting on each other's ideas, and in the end, all it is just shitty ideas or shitted on ideas. We haven't really done anything. The Harsh Reality Podcast is here, y'all, saying facts. Failure is only truly a tragedy if you don't learn anything from it. I can dig that. Again, y'all check out the recent, just came out this morning. Y'all check out that episode of the Harsh Reality Podcast. Good stuff. Make sure to drop comments too. I think that's one of the big things that's missing from these podcasts on KWAZ Radio. It used to be a time when I used to get a lot of comments on shows, and after my hiatus from podcasting, when I came back, I don't get comments as much. But understand that all of these hosts on all of these shows on KWAZ Radio, they're there waiting for you to drop a comment. Even if you disagree with something that was said, it can lead to a discussion, a further discussion. So make sure to drop your comments under these episodes when they post. Mr. Untouchable says, I have it. Downloaded it. He got it from the BM library. Right? Join the Discord. It's down. The link is down in the description. That's a fundamental reading. In fact, I think that's more fundamental than opinions. Right? I think the Carlos A. Cook's reader that only put together a couple of years ago, I think that's more fundamental too. Because that's about people, if you really check it, that's about people doing stuff and reporting to you what worked. We're not doing anything, and all we're doing is shitting on potentially good ideas. To continue with the reading, these remarks would be incomplete unless some attention is called to the particular geopolitics of Southern Africa. The configuration of oppression in Southern Africa is unique for several reasons. First, on the part of Africans, Southern Africa is a living nightmare, a provocative reminder to African revolutionary leaders and all African nationalists that the struggle to decolonize the whole of Africa has met with a rude and brutal shock, a concentration of oppression that haunts the human imagination. Again, this paper is from the 70s. This is from like when Mandela was being sent up the road. The situation in Southern Africa demonstrates the agonizing powerlessness of the independent African states and the difficulties facing the African liberation movements. It also demonstrates the profound challenge of the unfinished revolution. This imperative, once expressed eloquently in the idea that no African state is free or liberated until all of Africa is totally decolonized, must summon in each living African the conviction, the dedication, and the revolutionary energy to confront the most concentrated and the most rationalized system of oppression known in the history of the encounters of human groups in the last 400 years. Southern Africa is the most visible shame of African sovereignty. However, the right steps have already been taken by those African liberation movements and African revolutionary leaders and thinkers who have reached the highest stage of revolutionary consciousness. The latter group has concluded correctly that armed struggle is the only means of decolonization appropriate to the situation in South Africa. This armed struggle is being intensified in Guinea-Bissau, Angola, and Mozambique. But for many African states and leaders, this revolutionary consciousness is lacking. Many of these leaders continue to call for dialogues, for human understanding, for the goodwill and morality of the oppressor peoples and states. What's that term that was popular in the continent some years ago? Is it peace and reconciliation or something like that? Like that's the kind of weak stuff that we're hearing constantly from the continent. And frankly, it's the stuff that we hear from Africans in the West as well. Right? We need to convince the oppressed and all this old stupid shit for like reparations and all that stuff. Nah. The situation in Zimbabwe or Rhodesia, South Africa, and Namibia, Southwest Africa, is less open at the moment to effective armed insurrection simply because the racist white minority regimes in these lands have organized the most total and most brutalized form of human oppression in modern history. So this is the part of the paper I really, when I skimmed through it earlier, this is the part I liked. I liked his language, wasn't afraid, not afraid to say just what it is. You know, this is the kind of reading I like. To continue, however, the story that must be told about South Africa is not only the story of the powerlessness of the African states or the story of the inadequacy of the resources of the African liberation movements. The story that needs telling concerns the brutality and barbarism of the white racist settlers of Rhodesia and South Africa. The story that must be told is the story of Portugal's inhumanity, the story of the Portuguese wars of oppression and dehumanization in Guinea-Bissau, Angola, and Mozambique. These stories are to shock the moral sensibilities of all people everywhere, but the groans from the dark and concealed graves of white racist Southerners in South Africa are rarely heard in America or Western Europe. Whenever and wherever they are heard faintly, the forces of greed, the insatiable drive for super profits, and the rationalized voices of racial bigotry quickly drown out these dying echoes of human suffering. I like that term, super profits, by the way. I like that term. I think that's a good differentiation when you're talking about when you're trying not to be a capitalist per se, but you are about business, right? There's profiting and there's super profiting, which is the problem. Portugal, with a population of under 10 million and an illiteracy rate of 40%, is the most backward of the Western European countries. Imagine that, by the way. I don't know if you guys caught Oni's show on Sunday where he was comparing Barbados and the Bahamas. You know, one thing that I always remember, even as a kid, I always remember we had a high literacy rate. And that was under black rule at the time, or quote unquote black rule at the time, right? Under the UBP and stuff, the illiteracy rate was much higher. And it's funny to think that in 75 or something, that Portugal still had an illiteracy rate of 40%. It's very telling. It's very telling the folks that we're dealing with here. And it's very telling who's really boosting them up, who's really holding them up, right? Portugal has a per capita income of $500. But Portugal continues to colonize 12 million African peoples in what she calls her overseas provinces. Again, who's boosting these people up? Portugal justifies her exploitation of the African people by informing a deaf world that she is bringing racial harmony, European civilization, and Christianity to the African peoples. Portugal insists that the highest form of self-realization for the Africans is to transform them into Black Portuguese. And one African trader from Mozambique displayed his total deculturalization and de-Africanization recently when he declared, "I am Black and I am Portuguese." I am Black and I am Portuguese. There can be no greater self-negation than to declare, "I am African and I am Portuguese. I am Black and I am Portuguese." Who does that sound like in your neck of the woods? Right? Who does that sound like in your neck of the woods? This is the problem that we have. Hold on, I'm trying to find who was the Mozambican who said that shit. Does anyone know in the chat who said that? If you can look it up for me, I'll really appreciate that. Who said that? Right? From Mozambique, they said, "I am Black and I am Portuguese." Right? But how, you may ask, could Portugal subjugate the African people? How could she continue to indulge in her fantasies of grandeur? How could she continue a system of forced labor and neo-slavery if she is backward and impoverished, as we have said? Simple. Portugal retains her African colonies because Portugal is a member of the imperialist states of Western Europe and North America, a member of the Caucasian race, a member of NATO, and a champion of Western hypocrisy. The presence of NATO forces in Portugal allows Portugal to field the optimum number of troops in Africa, since NATO troops could maintain Portugal's stability at home. Boy. In her wars of oppression, Portugal flies planes manufactured and supplied by France, helicopters manufactured and supplied by Western Germany, to shoot bullets and machine guns made in England, and drop napalm bombs manufactured and supplied by the United States. Doesn't that sound like Pan-Europeanism to y'all? But we can't get Pan-Africanism going? Think about that. Think about what this guy just outlined here. Right? That's Pan-Europeanism. But when people mention Pan-Africanism, there's all these caveats. Well, we're not a monolith and all this old bullshit, like as if these people are a monolith. Today, South African troops are supporting the Portuguese Army in Mozambique. The United Nations cannot act against Portugal because the big powers in the Security Council can effectively immobilize the UN to favor Portugal's needs. Without the exploitation of her African colonies, Portugal cannot maintain her precarious economy. Even with the support of Western nations, Portuguese forces are now being stretched to their limits. In short, Portugal is in Africa because of the powerlessness of African states, and because the Portuguese presence is no less than the camouflage presence of all Western Europe and America. This conspiratorial presence for the purpose of human oppression and exploitation reveals itself most conspicuously in the efforts of the internal consortium now building the Cabora Bassa Dam across Zambezi's Quebra Bassa Gorge in Mozambique. The consortium, composed of firms from Britain, France, Italy, Portugal, South Africa, Western Germany, and Sweden, is financing the $280 million dam project. Portugal's plans include a rapid industrial development of the Zambezi Valley and settling of 1 million whites along the valley. South Africa has already contracted for 50% of the hydroelectric power to be generated from Cabora Bassa. The fruition of this plan would mean the consolidation of racist hegemony in the whole of Southern Africa. In South Africa, 3.5 million white racist settlers subjugate 16 million blacks, coloreds, and Asians under a system of total oppression and denial of all social, economic, and political rights. In South Africa, we have 16 million people out of a total population of 19.5 million who must carry passes on them at all times. 16 million people without a single representative in parliament. 16 million people without the right of membership in labor unions or the right to organize one. Such a system of total oppression demoralizes the human spirit and leads to resignation and hopelessness. In South Africa, we have 16 million semi-hopeless and resigned people. Nor is Rhodesia different. There, 250,000 white racist settlers have completely disenfranchised 5 million Africans. With the aid of General Motors, Gulf Ford Motor Company, Anglo-American Corporation, Anglo-American Investment Trust, American Firestone, Polaroid Corporation, American banking communities, to name a few, apartheid is maintained solidly while the white barbarians justify their position by appealing to Christianity and the Holy Scriptures. The U.S. sends 34% of her African exports to South Africa and 60% of her capital investment to South Africa. Add to that the investments of Canada, Britain, France, Western Germany, Holland, Japan, and the Scandinavian countries, and you get the picture of the powers that oppress the African people in Southern Africa. By the way, notice that there's a Japan in there. This is why you have to say Eurasian and not just European, right? Notice Japan inside there too. When will we do better? Then consider the greed and bigotry of the white racist settlers in South Africa. The white population amounts to 19%, but it has approximately 87% of the land surface. The remaining 16 million people are restricted to the less productive 13% of the land surface. The situation in South Africa is a perfect illustration of the basic character of the white peoples of the world. This is the part I want y'all to hear. There, white racism, white greed, twisted white Christian religion, white materialism, and white corporate capitalism have formed an international alliance for the oppression of the black man. You see, this writer has a little bit of balls here. History tells us that whenever the white people have encountered the rest of mankind, they decide usually to take all and leave nothing behind. They either steal all or they abuse all. They degrade all or they consume all. Whatever they cannot expropriate, the white folks degrade and render useless. Sign with them a treaty of free commerce and friendship, they manage to usurp your sovereignty and your political and economic rights. You know, I'm trying not to mention this group too much, although they are still a part of the African family. But this is what ADOS and FBA needs to hear. You're not doing anything in their land unless you're doing it armed. You're not doing anything in their land unless you're going to do it armed. Because as soon as you, I forget who said it, man, but someone said a long time ago, if a white guy is smiling, he's lying, right? As soon as you sign your little deals and like it says here, sign with them a treaty of free commerce and friendship, they'll manage to screw you over. This is why you just got to get away from these folks, man. I continue. Give them the hospitality of your land and home. They manage to render you homeless and landless. Ask them to share the gifts of Mother Earth. They alienate you from nature by cunning, treachery, thievery, piracy, and wars of conquest. Where these fail, they alienate lands, steal minerals, and enslave the rest of mankind. There is no appreciable history of white accommodation or adjustment to other races in the universe. Let me highlight that one there. I don't think y'all heard that. There is no appreciable history of white accommodation or adjustment to other races in the universe. Their values have inherent validity only insofar as they are elevated while simultaneously destroying, eradicating, or degrading other values and cultures. The encounter between black and white in South Africa, like the encounter between the impoverished world and the super affluent industrialized societies, reveals this profound moral depravity. And it will take divine intervention to unstain the history that Western civilization has written in its encounter with the rest of mankind. In conclusion, let it not be forgotten that the concern of the new breed of Africans must be the reactivation of the betrayed and unfinished African revolution in all its complex aspects. This revolutionary reactivation must begin with the profound transformation of the self, the decolonization of our minds and our social, cultural, and political institutions. This revolution against the inner self of the African personality is a precondition for all the other aspects of the transformation to come. There is very little morality in the present structure of the world. Africa's appeal to the morality of the world reflects more of her state of powerlessness than any serious conviction that the world could be morally persuaded to live by its professed moral principles. Africa will be liberated only when Africans summon their total energies to seize and conquer African freedom. That's the end of the paper. You know, I was thinking about this same thing that he talks about in the second to last sentence here. There's little morality in the present structure of the world. Africans' appeal to the morality of the world reflects more of her state of powerlessness than any serious conviction that the world could be morally persuaded to live by its professed moral principles. I hear Black folks all the time, and you hear that in the West a lot, that Africans have to save the world. That Africans have to save the world. That we are the moral compass for the world, and I've long thought of that as a weak mentality. Somehow we're the morality. If you think that you have to be the moral center, right, while the immoral is winning, you'll never win. If guys are cheating, you know, I was in a space about a week ago on Twitter listening to a guy talk about like getting government contracts and stuff like that. And one of the things he said is that people cheat to get the contracts. And if you ain't cheating, you ain't trying. The same is true for our situation. If people are being amoral towards us, you're going to have to be amoral towards them. And I know that that messes with some people's religious sensibilities, but that's just the bottom line. That's just the bottom line. In the chat, Mr. Untouchable says the author was going in on this paper. He was. He goes on to say they eat all the food and lick the plate to make sure you don't get no crumbs. Ain't that the truth? But you want to be moral with these people? Bobby Wright in the chat says, I keep telling Africans in America we will never be free without our own land, and that will take bloodshed. That was a topic of discussion apparently today on Twitter amongst people in the circle. If you're in the circle on Twitter, you know what I'm talking about, right? Folks was talking about going to, I want to say Mississippi or something like that. And others are saying, well, if you go to Mississippi, you're still in their land. Land equals freedom. If you check out my community tab, you'll see I put up a post. These other folks understand that land is freedom, and look what they did to get the land. Check out that community post I have up, right? Give it a thumbs up while you're there too. You got to be willing to do that if you want land. And then you got to be willing to do much more after that to maintain it. If you're going to be on someone else's, in someone else's nation inhabiting a piece of land. And that doesn't happen, by the way. And if it does somehow happen, right, look at what these Palestinians are dealing with. The learning curve says it's not our job. She's referring to that whole morality thing that a lot of Black folks stick to. Mr. Untouchable says the meek shall not inherit the earth. They will have to get in line because the hungry people will be sure to eat first. That's just That's just it. And speaking of the meek, some people ain't gonna like this, but this is what the LGBTQ shit is about. Trying to make more of our people meek and mild, just to be run over and eaten by the system, by the wolves. The learning curve says, I have this conversation all the time. People know this is true. They're having a hard time picking their people. You know? So this is the challenge, the unfinished revolution. We never finished the revolution, and in some cases, we never started it. We're still out here begging for scraps. We're still out here trying to appeal to some moral center that's not there. It's just not there. Anyway, I want to thank you guys for coming through. Shout out to the Learning Curve for being here. Mr. Untouchable, 242 to the world. Bobby Wright is here. The Harsh Reality Podcast was here. And I guess there was a couple other people lurking in the back who never showed their face. That's all good. But if you want to continue this conversation, post a comment down in the comment section. Let's continue the conversation. If you want this paper, join the Discord. Hit me a DM. I'm Koku on the Discord. Hit me a DM. I'll gladly pass this paper off to you. All right. I'll be back on Thursday. I'll be on the KWAZ Radio YouTube channel doing the show over there. I'm going to probably post a community post about this. But again, I'm very close to securing an instructor. The Pro-Black Perspective actually was in contact with them first. And I spoke to her recently. Very close to nailing this down. The thing that I would want is that I would want all of you to join in, but practice reciprocity. I would like to be able to tip this person and to encourage them. They're in Kenya. I'd like to encourage them to keep teaching. So I'm going to post a poll that asks the question, how many of you will be willing on maybe an early Saturday morning or something to join us in learning Kiswahili from a sister in Kenya? And will you be willing to tip? I'm not saying donations. I'm talking small denominations. Tip for her services. So I'll post a community post after the show. Oh, KW Don 7 is here saying Sawabona. Peace to you, KW Don 7. I appreciate you coming through. Yeah, so that's coming Thursday. I'll be on the Podcast Network YouTube channel. And then, of course, Saturday night, Shoot the Breeze. You guys join the Discord, post your prompts. We're going to have some rules implemented for Saturday night, Shoot the Breeze to make sure that we don't run on for forever on a prompt. But yeah, come through and have fun. Anyway, y'all, that's my time tonight. The Learning Curve says, great topic. I appreciate that, sis, for you coming through. And I'm glad that you guys enjoyed the paper itself. I hope that folks will post some questions or comments underneath the video so that we could continue the conversation some more. I will talk to you guys on Thursday. You guys be good. Peace.
Thanks for listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast with your host, Koku. If you like what you just heard, we hope you pass along our web address, bittermedicineblogs.com, to your friends and colleagues, and share our show to all your social media. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts. This has been a KWAZ radio production. Join us next time for another session of the Bitter Medicine Podcast. Follow us on Facebook at Bitter Medicine Show, Twitter, Bitter Meds, Tumblr, Bitter Meds, Instagram, Bitter Medicine.